Hello to everybody taking gender-based violence on campus. This week, our topic is the survivor experience. And so, obviously, a critical topic to any class on gender-based violence. And so, I wanted to make sure that we talked about that this week in light of some of the literature that's out there. And certainly, the survivor experience is something that's relevant to every week in our discussions. But this week, we'll take a special focus on that particular topic. So, I wanted to give you a few bits of perspective on that issue to frame the discussion. And I also want to say up front, I think there are likely people in our class who understand the survivor experience much better than I do. I want to acknowledge that up front. I do want to give you my perspective on it as a researcher, as someone who has sat down and talked with well over 100 women and men who've experienced sexual violence, and someone who's involved in the prevention movement. So I would start by saying that one of the things I've found is that there's great diversity in the experiences that people have in response to an incident of sexual violence, and that certainly not every incident is the same, and not every individual who experiences sexual violence is the same. People have different levels of resilience. People are at different stages of their life at different times, and lots of other factors there too. So certainly there's a lot of diversity there in terms of the human experience in response to severe trauma like sexual violence. There is also, I think, some unity in the experiences of many people who experience sexual violence. And I think that it's helpful for us to talk about the unity that is there among many, so that we might be able to better understand the various reactions and experiences that so many survivors tend to have. There are two different names that are thrown out in the research literature for the process that occurs after one experiences sexual violence. One of those was a term coined by Anna Burgess back in the 70s, I believe it was, and that would be called rape trauma syndrome. And then the other term being post-traumatic stress disorder. There's really very little difference in how those different processes play out. Certainly there are things that are specific to sexuality and sexual behavior that are quite different in rape trauma syndrome than it might be for experiencing PTSD from a war situation or something like that. But there are surprising commonalities in how one progresses or does not progress through PTSD or rape trauma syndrome. Now, so there are different schools of thought, slightly different schools of thought on whether you should use the term PTSD, whether you should use rape trauma syndrome. That is one of those issues in the field that I don't have a very strong opinion about. I use the two terms almost interchangeably. I think there's some that say we have to be specific to rape trauma syndrome, and others will say no, we have to be more general and talk about sexual violence as a traumatic event, and we can relate that to others. We talk about it as PTSD. I don't have a strong opinion on that, just to give you my lack of strong opinion on that. But I do want to make sure you know that difference occurs. When we talk about the commonalities that tend to exist between experiences that survivors have, that tends to fall into the category of rape trauma syndrome, PTSD. And the way that tends to play out is roughly in 4 stages. Now, they're not always linear, and someone can, move forward, back, all that other sort of thing. But for the purpose of exemplification, I want to talk for a minute about that process as linear, recognizing that no survivor is the same is exactly the same. No instance exactly the same. They're experienced in different ways by different people. But PTSD, in response to an incident of sexual violence, tends to include an initial stage of one might call it shock, one might call it acute disorganization. There are different words that are thrown out there for it, but stage 1 tends to include a feeling of almost being emotionally numb, sometimes sliding into emotionally exaggerated, for lack of a better term, extremely upset. But often there's the reaction of just being numb and very matter of fact and not really feeling much of anything. There tends to be a great deal of confusion in that stage. You'll see some of the same signs that you'll see in a general depressive reaction of changing in eating and sleeping habits and all that sort of thing. There is no rigid time that any of these stages last, but that tends to be weeks to a few months. And then often, not always, someone will enter a stage of what's called denial. And that's the most self-explanatory stage, where someone will, if they're describing what happened to them, will vastly minimize the impact of that experience, could even say, no, it didn't happen at all, and really doesn't want to deal with it. And if you think about it, that's certainly quite understandable. When you've experienced an extreme trauma, you then go through a period where you're hurting very deeply. The body, physically, as it's created, is only designed to take so much stress. And one of the things at denial, which I think is an underrated feeling, one of the things that denial allows us to do is to have kind of an emotional break and say, I can't deal with this anymore. And the survivors may go to the point to say it didn't happen. A little tidbit there, that's one of the reasons why some people like to claim that false reports were filed, when in fact it wasn't a false report at all. It was an accurate report, exactly what happened, but at some stage of recovery, someone might be interviewed and say, it didn't happen, I don't want to deal with it. And you have some people who are investigators who use more of a gotcha mentality to say, aha, see, that wasn't really the case. No, it's just part of rape trauma syndrome. So anyway, you have denial. And then that often, after a little while, will lead to a stage of more intense emotional feeling, very similar to what the first stage felt like. So almost like you're re-experiencing all the emotions again. There could be often changes in eating habits, sleeping habits, sexual behavior, a lot more, a lot less. It can go either direction. And really all of a sudden feeling like this is all happening all over again. Sometimes outsiders' reactions to that are, well, geez, what's going on? I mean, first the individual was, feeling horrible, and then they said everything was fine, and now they're feeling horrible again. I don't get it. That's just a part of PTSD. Sometimes people will come out of that. Sometimes they'll revert back to denial. But in a successful recovery, if we can call it recovery, kind of integration maybe even, someone moves to a fourth stage, which is much more rational. And I'm not saying that it's irrational otherwise, but speaking about the incident matter-of-factly, clearly placing the blame on the perpetrator, and saying things like, I would never have wanted this to happen to me, but it has, and I'm a stronger person for it and for surviving that. So lots of different reactions tend to occur around stage 4. That also makes it a lot more likely that someone will feel comfortable reporting what happened to them to authorities. One of the dynamics of PTSD as it intersects with sexual violence, and I've really alluded to this throughout my talking about PTSD. Someone can experience a incident of sexual violence, and if they are interviewed on 4 separate occasions, and they're in 4 different stages of rape trauma syndrome, they are very likely to describe exactly what happened to them in very different ways at different times. Our culture, our society says, if there's a difference in the story from time to time, that means the individual was lying. We have to flip that on its head. Because when someone who's been through a serious trauma describes things different ways at different times, it's all part of the body's natural reaction to trauma. And so that actually should increase our confidence in the veracity of the claim. Now, my own personal experience is if someone reports an incident of sexual violence, we believe them 100% of the time. And we talk with them as if, and in fact, this actually did happen. Now, we could, like in a case of a robbery or whichever, maybe we're uncertain as to who the perpetrator is, and they're entitled in a court proceeding to a presumption of innocence. But that doesn't necessarily mean in our own heads, when we're talking to survivors, we have to assume someone's innocent until proven guilty. That's a legal standard that's very important throughout our legal system, but that it's designed to make sure that we are very careful not to take away someone's freedom unless we're really darn sure that they committed a certain crime. So, at any rate, that's post-traumatic stress disorder. I want to say a couple more things about survivor reactions, and divided that into male reactions and female reactions, and really just very briefly touch on that. Common male reactions and experiences that are misunderstood, if it involves rape, penetration, frequently, well, let me not say frequently, sometimes the man can experience an ejaculation during a rape that's simply a result of physical stimuli to certain areas of the body. What some people misinterpret that as in, oh, well, this alleged survivor was sexually excited, so really they're not a survivor, they were a willing participant. Wrong. In fact, it can simply be a natural reaction to certain stimuli on certain parts of the body. So that's one piece. One other difference between male survivors and female survivors is that most often when a man experiences sexual violence, the perpetrator is someone of the same sex. When a woman experiences sexual violence, an incident of sexual violence, usually it's someone of the other sex. So that's not better, worse, it just adds different dynamics. For men, if they're raped by a man, sometimes that can cause them to question their masculinity, their sexuality, lots of different reactions like that. With women, one of the things that is unique to their experience is how our culture treats women and thinks of women. And I think there is this underlying feeling that a woman's word isn't as good as a man's. And I think we see that in a lot of incidents, and I think we see that happen in sexual violence. So something to think about there. I had various studies for you to read for this week. I hope that you learn a lot from them. I think they're fascinating pieces of work. And, you know, describing different survivor reactions and how they tend to experience rape and what might happen after, and how that affects their own susceptibility in the future to experiencing sexual violence. So lots of things in there. I really hope we have a great discussion over all that literature this week and the topic in general about anything I've said here, so that we really can hash out some of these issues and understand them on a deeper and more meaningful level. So let's have a great week, and if you need anything, just let me know.